1853. Meet Marie Grace, an American Girl, by Sarah Masters Buckey. Marie Grace's family consists of Papa, Marie Grace's father, a dedicated doctor who is serious but kind; Mrs. Curtis, a no-nonsense widow who has been the gardener's housekeeper for 4 years; Marie Grace, a shy, caring 9-year-old girl who is happy to be back in New Orleans; Uncle Luke, Marie Grace's uncle, who is a Mississippi River steamboat pilot; Argos, Marie Grace's dog, who is her constant companion; and her friends, Mademoiselle Oceane, a French opera singer who gives voice lessons; Lavinia Halsworth, a wealthy girl who likes to be the boss; and Cécile Ray, a confident girl who takes voice lessons with Mademoiselle Oceane. Chapter 1. Home Again. January, 1853. Marie Grace Gardner woke up to a strange sound coming through the window above her bed. She listened closely. Then she heard it again, the sweet high notes of trumpets and the rat-a-tat-tat of drums. She sat straight up in bed. It's music, she realized. Maybe it's a parade. Marie Grace loved parades, and Papa had told her that the parades in New Orleans were the best in the world. Marie Grace could hardly wait to see if it was true. She swung her feet onto the bare wood floor. Her big dog, Argos, had been curled up next to her bed. Now Argos lifted his head and looked at her through the gray fur that half covered his eyes. "Let's find Papa," she told him. Argos jumped up and hurried to the door. The room wasn't "see your breath frozen," as her room in Elton, Massachusetts, had always been in the winter, but it was chilly enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. Marie Grace searched in her trunk for something to wear over her flannel nightgown. She and her father and their housekeeper, Mrs. Curtis, had arrived in New Orleans only the night before. So far, all she had unpacked were her blankets, her nightgown, and the small oval portrait of her mother that she always kept by her bed. She grabbed a wool shawl from the trunk and stepped out of her room. "Papa," she called. Her voice echoed through the hall. There was no reply. Marie Grace guessed that her father was unpacking his office. She and Argos climbed down the outside stairs to the open courtyard. The stones felt cold under her feet, and she hurried to the door on the ground floor of the building. "Papa," Marie Grace began as she burst into her father's office, "I heard music outside and—" She stopped suddenly. Her father, Dr. Thaddeus Gardner, was sitting at his desk, but he wasn't alone. A handsome man with a mustache was sitting across from him. Papa must have a patient already, Marie Grace realized. "Excuse me, sir," she stammered, and began to retreat toward the door. But instead of following her, Argos yelped and rushed toward the man. For a moment, Marie Grace was afraid he was going to jump up on the stranger. "No, Argos," she cried. The man just laughed. "Hello, my friend," he greeted Argos and patted the dog's head. Argos wagged his tail so hard that it thumped against Papa's desk. The man stood up and grinned at Marie Grace. "Tea Marie," he exclaimed, "how wonderful to see you again. Why, you've grown to be the very image of your mamma." Marie Grace stared at the stranger. Her mother's nickname for her had been Tea Marie, but since Mamma had died, no one had ever called her by that name. Who is this man, she wondered. Her father stood up, too, and the sun from the window behind him glinted off his wire-rimmed glasses. "Marie Grace," he said, smiling, "you recall your Uncle Luke. He came to bring us a basket of food and welcome us home to New Orleans." Marie Grace nodded shyly. She had been born in New Orleans, but she had been away for so long that she now hardly recognized her uncle. He was her mother's youngest brother, and he worked as a pilot on a steamboat. When Marie Grace and her parents and her baby brother Daniel had lived in New Orleans 4 years ago, Uncle Luke had visited often. Marie Grace remembered him bringing news from Mama's family and treats from his trips up the river. One summer, Uncle Luke had surprised Marie Grace with a tiny gray puppy he had rescued and named Argos. Marie Grace and Argos had been friends from their very first day together. Whenever she had gone for walks with Mama and Daniel, or skipped rope in the courtyard, Argos had stayed close by her side. Marie Grace remembered it as the happiest time of her life. But that winter, a cholera epidemic had swept through the city. In one terrible week, Mama and Daniel had both died. Soon afterward, Papa had packed up his medical supplies and taken Marie Grace and Argos away from New Orleans and back to Pennsylvania, where he had grown up. Papa was a dedicated doctor, and he worked long hours taking care of the sick and the poor. But since many of Papa's patients couldn't pay, the Gardners were always short of money. During the last few years, they had moved from town to town in the Northeast, looking for just the right place for Papa to work. Moving had been hard for Marie Grace. None of the places where they lived ever seemed as warm and welcoming as the home she remembered with Mama and Daniel in New Orleans. Marie Grace had been happy when Papa decided it was time for them to return to New Orleans. Yet now, everything was unfamiliar. Even Uncle Luke. "How do you do, sir?" she mumbled, curtsying just as her mother had taught her so long ago. "Très bien," exclaimed Uncle Luke. "Very well." He gave her a hug and a quick kiss on each cheek. Then he said something else in rapid-fire French. She stared at him blankly. "We've been away so long that Marie Grace has forgotten much of her French," her father told Uncle Luke. "I'm afraid I'm a bit rusty, too." Uncle Luke shrugged as if to say that whatever language they spoke was not important. "I told your papa that it's good you were back home in New Orleans. All our family is looking forward to seeing you again," he explained in perfect English. "I remember how much you enjoyed visiting everyone in Belle Chenerie when you were little, and how brave you were." Marie Grace was astonished. "Me? Brave?" "Bien sûr, of course," said Uncle Luke. "You begged your mamma, my dear sister, to let you picnic by the bayou. She wisely said that there were too many alligators in the swamps for children to go exploring by themselves. But I will always remember my brave Marie. Only 4 years old, and you said, 'Alligators don't scare me.'" Marie Grace felt her face grow red while her father and Uncle Luke laughed together. She had a dim recollection of visiting Belle Chenerie, the little town not far from New Orleans where her mother's family, the Rousseaus, lived. She remembered playing with her cousins and paddling in a boat, but she couldn't ever remember being brave. Uncle Luke reached for his hat. "I must go and call upon a friend at the Royal Music Hall," he told them. "Why don't you both come with me? We could see the parades along the way." Marie Grace's eyes widened. "There really is a parade?" she asked, remembering the music she had heard. "There are lots of them today," said Uncle Luke. "It's the anniversary of our victory at the Battle of New Orleans. The biggest parade will be on Canal Street. It's the best in the city." Marie Grace looked hopefully at her father, but he shook his head and gestured at the stacks of boxes that filled his office. "I'm sorry, Luke," he said. "I have too much to do here." Marie Grace stared down at the dusty floor. "I'll never get to see the parade," she thought. Her uncle seemed to read her mind. "Perhaps Marie Grace could come to the parade with me," he suggested to her father. "She ought to see the celebration, and I would like to introduce her to my friend who sings with the opera." Uncle Luke turned to Marie Grace. "Do you still enjoy music, just as your mamma did?" "Oh, yes," said Marie Grace, her excitement overcoming her shyness. To Marie Grace's surprise and delight, Papa agreed to the plan. While Papa and Uncle Luke talked, she gulped her breakfast and quickly changed into her best wool dress and bonnet. Outside in the bright January sunlight, Uncle Luke helped her into a hired carriage. "Please take us to Canal Street, Monsieur Bernard," Uncle Luke told the driver as they settled onto the leather seat. "This young lady would like to see the parade." "Certainement," said the driver, a broad-shouldered man with black hair and light brown skin. He flicked his reins and they were off, the clip-clop of the horses' hoofs echoing against the stone paving. Monsieur Bernard steered the carriage down narrow streets, past colorful homes with arched doorways and shuttered windows. Pretty iron balconies reached out from many of the houses, and Marie Grace glimpsed walled courtyards behind the buildings. "Everything here is so different," Marie Grace thought, as they drove past trees heavy with green leaves in the middle of winter. Marie Grace caught the scent of onions and herbs cooking, and she took a deep breath. The tempting spicy smell wasn't at all like the plain foods Mrs. Curtis cooked. It reminded Marie Grace of the stews her mother used to make long ago. Soon the carriage turned onto a wide street that bordered the river. The street was bustling with people, and Uncle Luke said that the French Quarter, New Orleans' oldest neighborhood, was becoming busier every day. Buildings crowded one side of the street. On the other side was the majestic Mississippi River. Several steamboats churned up the river. Clouds of smoke and steam floated above the boats, and their high-pitched whistles pierced the air. Dozens of sailing ships and riverboats were docked along the levee. Uncle Luke pointed out his steamboat, the Eleanor, which was piled high with crates of cargo. "It's one of the fastest boats on the river," he said proudly. "And look over there. There's Jackson Square," said Uncle Luke, as they passed a large square filled with gardens. "It's General Jackson's victory in 1815 that we're celebrating today. The people in New Orleans fought back the British to protect the city." On the other side of the square, Marie Grace saw a towering white building with 3 spires that reached to the sky. It reminded her of a picture in a fairy tale book. "Is that a castle?" she guessed. "No, that's St. Louis Cathedral," Uncle Luke said, smiling. "Beautiful, isn't it? And soon you'll see the parade." When they reached Canal Street, Marie Grace and her uncle stepped out of the carriage and joined the crowds lining both sides of the street. Some of the spectators were wedged in doorways, and others stood along the edge of the road waving handkerchiefs and American flags. Marie Grace stared in amazement. The parade was far grander than anything she had ever seen before. Row after row of soldiers marched by in carefully pressed uniforms, their swords swinging by their sides. A group of white-haired men who had fought in the Battle of New Orleans marched proudly too. As the men passed by, the crowd cheered wildly. Drums beat out the rhythm, and horns blared from the brass bands. The music was so thrilling that Marie Grace wished she could march along too. "New Orleans must be the best city in the world," she thought, her toes tapping to the music. "Surely it has the best parades. I wish Papa was here to see it." After the last drummers passed by, pounding a thunderous beat, Uncle Luke gave Marie Grace his arm. Together they made their way up Canal Street along a raised sidewalk, which Uncle Luke called the banquette. He was telling Marie Grace an exciting story about pirates who once lived in New Orleans when a man called out, "Mr. Rousseau, a word with you, please." Uncle Luke stopped and tipped his hat. Then he introduced Marie Grace to Mr. Holsworth, a plump, well-dressed man, and his daughter, Lavinia, who looked slightly older than Marie Grace. As Mr. Holsworth talked with Uncle Luke about shipping cotton on the Eleanor, Marie Grace smiled hesitantly at the other girl. "It was a wonderful parade," Marie Grace ventured. Lavinia did not smile back. She surveyed Marie Grace's plain dress and bonnet with a critical eye. "I can't be bothered with parades," she replied. Marie Grace's face grew hot with embarrassment. Did I say something wrong, she wondered. Lavinia wrapped herself in her fur-lined cloak. "I prefer private parties, and balls where only the best in society are invited," she added. Then she thrust out her chin and turned to her father. "May we go now, Father?" Lavinia pleaded. "My friend Sophronia is expecting me." Mr. Holsworth checked the heavy gold watch that hung from his waistcoat. "Very well," he said. Then he and Lavinia walked briskly away, without even saying goodbye. Uncle Luke shook his head as he watched them leave. "It seems as if they are in quite a rush, and on a holiday, too." "I don't think Lavinia liked me," Marie Grace confessed. "She says she prefers the best in society, but I'm not sure what that is." "Don't worry about Lavinia," Uncle Luke advised, as he and Marie Grace continued along the banquette. "The Halsworths may judge others by how much money they have. But plenty of people will be friendly to you, if you are friendly to them. I'm sure you'll find lots of friends in New Orleans." Marie Grace was silent. During the last few years she had moved so many times that it had been hard for her to make friends at all. "Maybe it will be different here," she told herself. "We'll take a shortcut to the music hall," said Uncle Luke as they turned a corner. Compared to the bustling crowds on Canal Street, this narrow street was quiet, almost deserted. Suddenly Marie Grace heard a man's harsh voice yell, "Stop, you!" She whirled around. Behind her, two burly white men grabbed a black boy of about 14 or 15. "Let me go!" the boy protested loudly. Then he said something in French that Marie Grace did not understand. The larger of the two white men shook the boy by the collar. "You look like the slave who ran away from Gray's plantation," the man shouted at him. "Show us your papers." Marie Grace's heart beat fast. She turned back to her uncle, whose face was suddenly serious. "We go this way," he told Marie Grace. He steered her away from the men and into an alleyway where the buildings were so close together that they nearly blocked out the sun. When they were out of earshot, Marie Grace asked, "Why did those men stop that boy? Did he do something wrong?" "They think he's an escaped slave," Uncle Luke explained. "But the boy said he and his whole family are gens de couleur libres." Marie Grace looked up at him, puzzled. "Free people of color," her uncle translated. "In New Orleans, not all people of color are slaves. Many are free, and they have some of the rights that white people have." In the years she had spent in the Northeast, Marie Grace had not known many people of color, free or slave. But she had often heard her father say that slavery was wrong, and he believed that all people should be treated equally. "If that boy is free, why did those men stop him?" Marie Grace asked. Uncle Luke shrugged. "They wanted to check his papers. People of color have to carry papers to prove they are free." Marie Grace frowned. "I don't understand." "Some free people of color are wealthy," Uncle Luke explained. "They own businesses and big houses, and they have their own society. But many others are not rich, and if they're suspected of being escaped slaves, they have to show papers to show they're free. For that boy's sake, I hope he has papers." "I hope so too," thought Marie Grace, remembering the fear in the boy's eyes. At the end of the hallway, Uncle Luke led Marie Grace to the back of an imposing stuccoed building. "Bonjour, Louis," Uncle Luke greeted the man at the door. "Is Mademoiselle Michel in?" "Oui, Monsieur Rousseau. She's with a student," said the elderly watchman, waving them inside. "Mademoiselle Oceane Michel is French, and she trained in Paris," said Uncle Luke as they climbed the stairs. "She has the most beautiful voice. Besides singing in the opera in New Orleans, she gives lessons to talented young students." "I'm going to meet a real opera singer," Marie Grace thought. Her hands were damp with nervousness as she held on to the banister. When they reached the upstairs hall, Uncle Luke stopped in front of a tall door. Marie Grace heard a shrieking noise that sounded like someone trying to sing a high note and failing miserably. Is that what Uncle Luke means by talented students, she wondered? Uncle Luke glanced over at Marie Grace, and then he covered his ears. Marie Grace started to giggle, and Uncle Luke burst into a deep, hearty laugh. Suddenly the singing stopped. The door swung open. A girl about Marie Grace's age glared at them. Marie Grace stopped laughing. "What have I done now?" she wondered.